thank you guys for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you today. My talk today is going to focus on Atlantic history, or on Atlantic Africa. And Atlantic Africa, if you don't know, is the region pretty much from Senegal in the north to the southern border of Angola, down in this area. And it extends inland about 1,000 miles to the Great Bend of the Niger River, extending southward to the bend of the Congo River, and then coming down here. Now, just to help you understand the significance of this and why I'm focusing on this area, in this area, by the time Europeans arrived in 1444, was tied together through commerce, culturally tied together through commerce, and thousands of years of trade had created similar cultural religious practices in this region. And this is also the region where most of the slaves that were brought from Africa to the Americas came from. I'm going to kind of digress a little bit before I get into Atlantic Africa, just to kind of help you understand, I think, or conceptualize water culture and what scholars call water people. And so I actually want to begin today, not in Africa, but in Hawaii. And so on January 22nd, 1799, surgeon's mate David Samwell wrote one of the first accounts of surfing, an account that captured Western apprehensions about water and other people's affinity with immersing themselves in this liquid element. From the deck of Captain James Cook's ship, the Discovery, he penned, quote, "These people find one of their chief amusements in what to us presented nothing but horror and destruction. And we saw with astonishment young boys and girls about 9 or 10 years of age playing amid such tempestuous waves that the hardiest of our seamen would have trembled to face them. They looked upon this as nothing other than certain death." Here you have an early image of surfing in Hawaii. Samuel's account illustrates Western land-oriented perceptions of the world, revealing how their anxieties about water and swimming caused them to misconstrue Hawaiian aquatic cultural values. Most people of European descent were afraid of the water and regarded swimming as a life-threatening pursuit. Indeed, the quote-unquote horror and destruction of surfing illustrates European beliefs about the ocean, namely that it was a place of peril and death, even for men who had just spent 3 years aboard ship. Like other Europeans, Samwell categorized surfing as mere amusement because Europeans could not appreciate the deep spiritual, cultural, and political underpinnings that water could afford to non-Western societies. Westerners' beliefs concerning humans' natural elements with land and fears of water were similarly articulated in accounts of frightened transatlantic voyagers, as related by William Bradford, governor of Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts. In September 1620, Bradford witnessed the landing of pilgrims who, quote, "fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from the perils and miseries, again to set foot on the firm and stable earth, their proper element," end quote. Scholars are often too bound to sources authored by Western chroniclers who, like themselves, are guided by their terrestrial backgrounds and perspectives, causing them to incorrectly conclude that cultural creation only occurred ashore. Most treat waterways as literary backdrops for terrestrial events, failing to consider how oceans, rivers, and lakes served as a cultural and political space for Africans, Asians, Amerindians, and Polynesians who swam and dove in waterways. Scholars have been seductively lulled into a terrestrial paradigm, viewing the world as continental Europeans and Americans, gazing landward with their backs to the sea. When we recognize maritime influences, we often assume that individuals were either landspeople or mariners, farmers or fishermen, but not both. Yet most societies were comprised of fishing farmers and farming fishermen, who intimately understood and interlaced their landward and maritime lives. Individuals pursued fishing and farming as seasons dictated, and after harvesting crops, carried them to market in boats. Likewise, it was not uncommon for for men to shift between land, side, and maritime occupations over the course of their lives, going to sea as young men before securing less strenuous and dangerous shoreside occupations. We see the world as landspeople, forgetting that Atlantic Africans were water people, whose lives, cultural traditions, means of travel, and worldviews were informed by relationships with the water. Water people, like landspeople, accommodated themselves to their environment, finally weaving their spiritual beliefs, economies, social structures, political institutions, and methods of warfare, the very ways of life, around personal and societal relationships with the water. And to go back to this image here, this is actually, as the title says, the water systems of Atlantic Africa. And so you can see how Atlantic Africa is bordered to the east and to the south along this coast here by the Atlantic Ocean, and really framed by large rivers, and then bisected by numerous rivers, and you can see there's several large lakes in this region. Many Atlantic African societies were situated along broad bodies of water, and their members were water people. Yet we overwhelmingly consider terrestrial experiences, ignoring Africans' interaction with the water. Current representations of Africa and Africans focus on warfare, drought, and famine, causing us to forget Africans' maritime past and present. Indeed, the world was shocked to find that Somali fishermen turned pirates from East Africa's coastal desert possessed the maritime abilities to cripple modern shipping. We can provide a more nuanced understanding of Africans' maritime experiences by borrowing from scholars' conceptualization of Polynesia. Scholars of Polynesia have recently stressed that earlier land-bound studies misconstrue the region and its people's relationship with the sea, challenging us to view the world as Polynesians did. Tongan scholar Apele Hawafa rejected this, what he regarded to be this belittling tendency of continental scholars who defined Polynesia as quote-unquote Pacific Islands, shrinking the expanse by focusing on humans' relationship with dry areas, while ignoring how Polynesians imagined their space. Polynesians' world was not confined to land. Islands and seas formed seamless cultural and political spaces, a quote-unquote sea of islands. Polynesianists have replaced the term Pacific Islands with Oceania to signify the vastness of their region while recognizing Polynesians' connections with the sea. Viewing the world through Polynesianist lens permits us to more fully recognize and appreciate Africans' swimming and surfing histories. Unlike early Europeans, Africans were not afraid of the water. They did not regard land as their proper element, and water as a hostile space. Like Polynesians, most Africans were equally comfortable on land and water, deeming swimming as natural as walking. They merged waterscapes and landscapes to form unified cultural scapes that afforded their lives with social, cultural, economic, and political meaning. Long before the Portuguese sailed into sub-Saharan Africa in 1444, many Africans had become expert swimmers and underwater divers, perfecting the freestyle at a time when most Europeans could not swim well enough to save their own lives. As in Hawaii, the first recorded interaction between Africans and Europeans took place on the sea as mariners possessing divergent cultural perceptions of the world met off the coast of Senegal. The earliest Portuguese sailors to enter this region came from a maritime culture, yet were relatively poor swimmers, causing them to become astounded by African swimming and underwater diving expertise, which befuddled their ability to capture and interrogate them, or interrogate 5 canoemen who had paddled out to their ship to inspect it. As the Portuguese endeavored to seize these men, they, quote, leapt into the water, causing the sailors great toil in the capture of those who were swimming, for they dive like cormorants, end quote. Even though this event took place well offshore, probably a couple miles out to sea, these African swimming dexterities permitted 3 to escape. Well into the 20th century, white onlookers continued to be amazed by the swimming abilities of Atlantic Africans. From the 15th through the 19th century, the swimming and underwater diving abilities of people of African descent typically surpassed those of Westerners. Indeed, sources indicate that most whites, including sailors, could not swim. For example, in 1838, the Sailor's Magazine, which was a New York City missionary magazine, published the inscription of a city placard titled "Swimming." It read, "For want of knowledge of this noble art, thousands are annually lost, and every fresh victim calls more strongly upon the best feeling of those who have the power to draw attention of such persons as may be likely to require this art to the simple fact that it is not difficult to float or swim." Atlantic Africa is a region dominated by water, and its people possess a rich swimming tradition. Mastery of the water permitted Africans to transform what would have otherwise been a backdrop for land-bound events into cultural and political spaces used to shape social relationships between members of numerous ethnic groups, as well as between Africans and Europeans. This talk documents the swimming, surfing, and underwater diving skills of Africans. First, it compares the swimming abilities and techniques of Africans and Westerners to demonstrate that people of African descent were stronger swimmers than most white people. Then it considers how Africans incorporated swimming into work, recreational, and political activities. In a talk tomorrow, I'll also discuss how slaves carried these skills to the Americas, where they integrated them into their daily lives. Most early Westerners could not swim, and documents suggest that when whites swam, they usually used variants of the breaststroke, which is a relatively rudimentary stroke. Additionally, most rendered their breaststroke akin to the dog paddle by keeping their heads above water, which placed a strain on their backs, causing rapid fatigue. In the 16th century, European theorists began publishing treatises on swimming. Most advocated versions of the breaststroke, while excluding discussions of the swim stroke now known as the crawl or the freestyle. Importantly, swimming theorists targeted literate nobility and gentry, largely evolved as analytical speculation, concerned with developing quote-unquote ideal forms of swimming. These theories were constructed apart from swimmers and thus had little influence on contemporary swimming practices. Conversely, coastal and interior Africans used variants of the freestyle, enabling them to incorporate swimming into daily activities. With the alternate overarm stroke combined with fast scissor kicks, the freestyle is the strongest and swiftest swimming style. Travelers mentioned that considerable numbers of Africans swam and that they were usually better swimmers than Europeans, and indicate that Westerners tended to use the breaststroke while Africans preferred the freestyle. Significantly, many observers refer to the breaststroke as the quote-unquote ordinary method of swimming, indicating that white people preferred this stroke. Most travelers to Atlantic Africa reported that Africans, again, were sound swimmers. Several also noted that they were better swimmers than Europeans. And in 1455, Venetian merchant Alice de Carabosto expressed that Africans living along the Senegal River, which is right here, are, quote, the best, are the most expert swimmers in the world, end quote. In the late 16th century, after Dutch adventurer Piet de Mare commented on Gold Coast Africans' freestyle technique, he wrote, quote, "They can swim very fast, generally easily outdoing people of our nation in swimming and diving," end quote. Let me just show you this map. So the accounts I'm primarily talking about right now are from the Gold Coast, or this purple area, but you can see there's 7 primary regions in this area of Atlantic Africa. Describing the freestyle used by Gold Coast peoples and the breaststroke employed by Europeans, John Barbeau asserted that, quote, "the blacks of Elmina outdo all others in the coast in dexterity of swimming, throwing one arm after the other forward as if paddling, and not extending their arms equally and striking them together as Europeans do." Similarly, Asante men and women at Lake Busumtwi, which is about 100 miles inland, about where the pointer was, used the freestyle. According to anthropologist Robert Rattray, Asante men, quote, "are very fine swimmers, and some show magnificent muscular development. They swim either the ordinary breaststroke, like Europeans, or a double overarm with scissor kick. And just to give you an example, and here you have an image, a much later image from the 1880s, 1884, and you can see, this is in the Sudan, but you can see these men using, clearly using a method of a freestyle with the overarm stroke. Maritime disasters juxtapose the swimming prowess of Africans and inabilities of those of Europeans' descent. Typically, when boats sank, Africans were able to save themselves. One of two things usually happened to white people aboard stricken boats. Either Africans saved them or they drowned. U.S. naval official Horatio Bridge provided examples of both. On December 11, 1843, Bridge noted that Marines debarking in Liberia upset the canoe they traveled in. Quote, unable to swim, one was upheld by a crewman. And crew is the name of an ethnic group, an African ethnic group. On October 15, 1844, Bridge explained that 5 whites and 5 crew were in a boat that, quote, capsized and sank. The 5 crew saved themselves by swimming until picked up by a canoe. The 5 whites were lost. Significantly, no accounts were found in which white persons swam to save the lives of drowning Africans. So high was the white drowning rate along the coast of Africa that some Africans recast their spiritual beliefs to make sense of this phenomenon. Many people believed that deities inhabited and controlled waterways. Some came to believe that these deities drowned Europeans as punishment for offenses they committed. In 1887, Alfred Ellis explained how many Gold Coast people believed that a deity named Akumbrafo, who was called, quote, the slayer of white men, upset boats in the area along the coast. Explaining how this deity determined the fortunes of both Africans and Europeans, he wrote, quote, this god has been apparently introduced to account for the number of instances in which boats are capsized, the white occupants, either unable to swim or less powerful swimmers than the black crew, are the only persons drowned. Since the blacks, though equally thrown into the water, escape while the whites perish, it is evident to the native mind that this god has a special dislike for whites. End quote. Recognizing the superior capabilities of many people of African descent, some whites advocated their use as lifeguards. In 1804, Dr. George Pincard was in Barbados, and he wrote that slaves' swimming expertise, quote, renders the Negroes peculiarly useful in moments of distress, such as in the case of accidents at sea or in the harbor, end quote. When high surf inhibited the embarkation of several hundred slaves to an awaiting slave ship, French slave trader Theophilus Canoe employed African lifeguards to ensure the safe passage of his manacled human property. Canoe recorded that, quote, a lot of youth were appointed to swim off wherever a canoe should capsize, and slave after slave was rescued by this swimming party, end quote. There is no evidence that Westerners ever officially employed people of African descent as lifeguards. However, they de facto provided this service. In Robert Baker's 1568 poem of Shipwreck and Disaster on the Gold Coast, he related how Africans saved him and 8 shipmates when their longboat overturned some distance from shore. Similarly, when a canoe landed Paul Isert at Benin, he, in his own words, wrote, had the unpleasant experience of being submerged with a canoe. I was tossed around in the breakers until a black came swimming out from shore and pulled me onto his back and thus saved me. Sources indicate that Europeans stopped swimming for a number of reasons. During the medieval period, swimming came to be regarded as a fruitless struggle against nature, and changes in warfare favoring heavily armored knights precipitated a shift in military tactics and, in turn, attitudes regarding the utility of swimming. Concurrently, many European doctors urged people to avoid swimming because immersion in water purportedly upset the body's natural balance, called the fluid humors, causing diseases like the bubonic plague and cholera. Since swimming was generally performed nude, Catholic officials discouraged it for moral reasons. By the 15th century, the freestyle had been forgotten, and the few Europeans who swam used the breaststroke, which remained the preferred style into the early 20th century, or at least in the late 19th century. Most white people remained reluctant to swim, making them less adept than many blacks, Native Americans, and Asians. Indeed, after swimming theorist Michel Pivot explained that swimming was quote, greatly esteemed among the ancients in his 1696 swimming treatise, he then stated, but come to our times, it is most certain that the Indians and the Africans excel all others in the art of swimming and diving. It is to them that the ladies are obliged for their ornaments of pearls. They are the divers who fish them up. They are also very useful for recovering anchors and merchandise that have been cast away. Westerners were averse to the freestyle because it naturally generated considerably more splashing than the breaststroke. And according to theorists and pragmatists like Benjamin Franklin and Theodorus Mason, swimming should be, quote, smooth and gentle, end quote. Since splashing was deemed unsophisticated, the freestyle was largely regarded as unrefined and uncivilized when compared to the breaststroke. Thus, even though the breaststroke is one of the more basic strokes, Westerners regarded it as the most refined and graceful swim stroke. George Catlin's observations of Native Americans' use of the freestyle reveals that although whites recognized that it was a stronger and faster than the breaststroke, they deemed it uncivilized and thus unworthy of their use. Quote, by this bold and powerful mode of swimming, referring to the freestyle, which may want in grace many would wish to see, I am quite sure from the experience I've had that much of the fatigue and strain upon the breast and spine caused by the breaststroke are avoided, and that a man will preserve his strength and his breath much longer when using the alternate rolling motion than he can in the usual mode of swimming in the polished world, end quote. One other striking difference between Africans and Western swimming practices was that many African women swam, while Western women generally did not. This is probably because most people swam nude, and Western standards of modesty did not tolerate the public disrobing of white women. African women, however, were not so constrained. Because Africans felt less shame than Westerners about publicly revealing their bodies, and because the African climate was hot and humid, many African women did not completely clothe their bodies. Hence, they could disrobe when swimming in the presence of men without stigmatizing themselves. After describing male swimming proficiencies, Pieta de Mare noted, quote, many of the women here can swim very well too. Robert Rattray similarly wrote that Asante women are, quote, as expert as the men, and I used to see whole family parties alternately wading and swimming along the shore, the lake shore, instead of following the road running between villages, end quote. Accounts indicate that after Atlantic Africans learned to swim at a relatively young age, they incorporated this skill into numerous activities. While there is no evidence indicating at what age interior peoples learned to swim, travel accounts report that coastal peoples learned as toddlers, either right after learning to walk between the age of 10 to 14 months, or after they were weaned at approximately 2 years of age. Pieta de Mare explained, quote, once the children begin to walk by themselves, they soon go to the water in order to learn how to swim, end quote. William Bosman commented, quote, the mothers give their infants suck for 2 or 3 years. When over, they are able to go to the seaside to learn to swim. After parents taught them the fundamentals of swimming, children improved these skills by playing in the ocean and observing the techniques of stronger swimmers. While at Elmina, John Barbeau saw, quote, several hundred boys and girls sporting together before the beach, and in many places among the rolling, breaking waves, learning to swim, end quote. He then contended that African swimming abilities, quote, proceeds from their being brought up, both men and women from their infancy, to swim like fishes, and that with their constant exercise renders them so dexterous. Some societies were literally built upon the water, providing their members with intimate interactions with surrounding waterways. In many places, water dominated the land during much of the year, compelling community members to swim on a daily basis. On floodplains in the Congo River Basin, for example, and in shallow lakes throughout Africa, people built homes on stilts and often swam between dwellings and as they set and collected fish traps. And this image here is from the interior of the Congo. And again, you can see these two people using what seems to be the freestyle. In another image, I'm not sure how well you can see it, it's a little bit dark, but it's at hot springs in Central Africa, again in the interior of the Congo. And here, it primarily shows people wading, but also that if you read the account, it describes them swimming as well. Many Africans incorporated swimming into their daily work activities. Canoemen and fishermen often swam on a daily basis. As canoes were launched from the beach, watermen often swam alongside to keep their bows pointed towards oncoming waves to prevent them from tipping. When canoes overturned in the surf, canoemen swam to save their own lives, and as John Barbeau reported, quote, being expert swimmers and divers recovered goods from upset canoes. Canoemen's strong swimming abilities and Westerners' relative inability forced white people to respect canoemen in ways that cut across accepted views concerning race. Since European-style rowboats could not pass through the African surf, virtually all the goods, as well as the slaves that were shipped or transported between ship and shore, were carried in African dugout canoes. Prudent Europeans realized that their lives could be dependent on canoemen's swimming abilities, and that it was unwise to express racist sentiments towards canoemen or to otherwise abuse them. Whether intentionally or accidentally, canoes manned by the best watermen could overset in the surf, and offended canoemen could swim away from, rather than towards, drowning Europeans. In 1693, English slave ship captain Thomas Phillips advised Europeans to treat canoemen with respect, saying, "We've entered drowning every time we go ashore and come off again. The canoes frequently overset, but the canoemen are such excellent divers and swimmers that they preserve the lives of those who have any kindness for. But such as they have any displeasure to, they will let shift for themselves. Therefore, 'tis prudent for all commanders to be very kind and obliging to them, their lives lying in their hands, which they can make them lose at pleasure and impute all to accident." Likewise, when European ships sank in African waters, Africans recovered sunken goods and saved drowning Europeans. Sources indicate that Africans incorporated swimming and diving into several occupations. In 1863, Richard Burton noted that Africans around Carpenter Rock, Sierra Leone, dove for oysters, saying, "It is celebrated for its excellent rock oysters, which are brought up in great quantities by divers." When seas were too high for either dugout canoes or European rowboats to launch or land through the surf, intrepid swimmers sometimes carried letters to and from ships anchored up to 3 miles offshore. While in Senegal in 1453, Alvise de Cadamosto detailed the bravery and swimming abilities of one of the first of these letter carriers, exclaiming, "This to me was a marvelous action. I concluded that these coast Africans are indeed the finest swimmers in the world," end quote. Divers played a central role in some states' political and economic development by obtaining different forms of currency and export commodities. The Mambaba province of the Kingdom of Congo was particularly important because it controlled the Congo's southern coast, especially the island of Luanda, and its surrounding waterways where cowrie shells were harvested. And here you can see 2 examples of cowrie shells, and individual ones. Then they'd be strung together and used oftentimes as currency. In the late 16th century, Duarte Lopes observed women diving to harvest these shells, writing, quote, "This island of Luanda furnishes the money used in the Kingdom of Congo and by neighboring people. For along its shores, women dive underwater, filling their baskets with sand. They sift out certain small shellfish and separate the male and female, the latter being most prized for its color and brightness, end quote. Elsewhere, others dove for gold, which was a widely sought after commodity. John Barbeau noted that, quote, the river Manku in the Gold Coast is full of waterfalls and rocks which make it unnavigable. It produces much gold, though, which the blacks fish for, diving under rocks and into the waterfalls, which you can see here in this image. The arrival of Europeans permitted some coastal peoples to lucratively employ their diving skills to scrape barnacles from the hulls of encrusted ships, which created drag, slowing their progress. When the brig John Jones arrived at Monrovia, Liberia in December 1861, crew watermen scoured the ship's hull. Impressed by the divers' lung capacity, Charles Stewart penned, "We employ them to scrape the barnacles from the bottom of the vessel several times, their power of remaining underwater being truly remarkable." While most Western travelers did not venture into Africa's interior, upcountry accounts indicate that a significant number of inland people could swim. Alato Equiano commented that some interior people could not swim, but others were relatively adroit. Shortly after being kidnapped into slavery, Equiano saw Africans in what is now Nigeria's interior swimming in a large river. Having never previously seen a large body of water or someone swim, Equiano, who could not swim, was amazed by what he saw, saying, I was often very much astonished to see some of the women, as well as the men, jump into the water, dive to the bottom, and come up again and swim about. Similarly, when Robert Rattray visited Lake Busan-Tui, which is here, again, about 100 miles inland in what's now Ghana, he noted that Asante men and women were adept at both the breaststroke and the freestyle, which they used to cross the lake and to catch fish. The Asante living around Lake Busan-Tui relied heavily on swimming and diving to catch fish because they had an anthropological lake god named Tui, who imposed many taboos associated with the use of this lake, one of which precluded the use of boats on this lake. In keeping with divine sanctions, the Asante either swam or used paddleboards called pajua in singular or mpajua in the plural form to traverse the lake and to catch fish. And you can see two examples here of these in pajua. Fishermen dove from pajua with conical-shaped nets to catch fish. Grasping the wider end of the cone-shaped net, quote, a fisherman dives into the water, dragging it along the bottom or among a shoal of fish, and keeping the water pressure against the pocket end keeps the fish that enter it till he comes to the surface, end quote. Larger versions of these nets were similarly used by teams of fishermen. These nets were taken by Padua to depths that permitted the net to span the distance between the lake's surface and the bottom of the water, so usually about 10 feet in depth. 5 or 6 fishermen, each on their own Padua, scared fish into these nets by lining up about 20 yards from the open end of the net, and simultaneously start off at top speed, yelling Padua, 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 and splash it into the water, end quote. When they reached the mouth of the net, they dove off their paddleboard, swam down, picked up the bottom of the net, and brought it to the surface of the water, catching large numbers of fish. Mungo Park's journeys deep into the interior of Africa revealed that many inland peoples were strong swimmers. In 1796, while over 500 miles inland, Park observed a fisherman dive underwater to collect and set fish traps. The fisherman's lung capacity was so great that he remained submerged, quote, for such a length of time that I thought he had actually drowned himself, end quote. During Park's second expedition, he was accompanied by 43 Europeans, all of whom ultimately died, most of them because they couldn't swim. While crossing the Bafing River in present-day Guinea, about 300 miles inland, a canoe carrying 3 soldiers overturned. Quote, the natives from the shore swam to their assistance, yet a soldier was unfortunately drowned. The natives dived and recovered 2 muskets and the soldier's body. end quote. Park and the other surviving European party members, however, ultimately died because they could not swim. During a battle on the Niger River against Africans, they drowned after jumping overboard. While an enslaved canoeman and their, only an enslaved canoeman and their interpreter, Amandi Fatouama, lived to carry Park's journal back to British officials and to tell of his demise. Coastal Africans' underwater diving abilities served as spectator sport for visiting Westerners and sources of income for swimmers. Today, many waterside tropical locations at many waterside tropical locations throughout the world, local children impress tourists by diving for coins that tourists toss into the water from either docks or from boats. The same was true in early modern Africa. As this image, this image is of Somali children, but it demonstrates the same point. While William Bosman noted that the underwater diving displays of Africans from the Ivory and Grain Coast, writing, quote, "You are probably acquainted with the expertise swimming and diving of these Africans, which I have several times seen with surprise. Whenever they were on board our ship, I threw a string of coral or something else into the ocean. One of them would immediately dive in after it, and though almost got to the bottom, fetch it up again. They seldom missed it and were sure of what they brought up as their reward." On January 14, 1862, a similarly impressed Charles Stewart described how crew watermen dove for coins from his ship's yardarm, which would have been about 25 feet above the water, saying, quote, "I have often stood on the quarterdeck, which is 13 feet from the surface, and thrown copper coins into the water, having a young man on the yardarm, who when I threw the money, would dive from this lofty perch and almost invariably recover it," end quote. Africans equally demonstrated their lung capacity when catching sea turtles. When John Lawrence was off the coast of Liberia in 1844, he documented how 3 crew sailors dove into the water to catch a sea turtle, saying, quote, "They divested themselves of their clothes in a twinkle and were in the ocean in a chase after him, but the turtle dived when they got within about 40 or 50 feet of him. But the chase did not end here, as a submarine pursuit took place, which was astonishing as well as amusing to witness. One would hardly suppose that men could acquire such perfection in swimming as they practice here," end quote. Swimming was incorporated into some Africans' judicial processes, namely their forms of trial by ordeal. After visiting Ouidah, which is in the modern country of Benin, in 1698, Bosman wrote, quote, "that if any person is accused of any crime and denies the fact, he could clear their name by swimming across a river to which is ascribed the strange quality of immediately drowning all guilty persons which are thrown into it," end quote. However, since all the Africans in the area are, quote, "very expert, I never heard of this river convicting any person, for they all come out alive," end quote. Some Igbo communities in present-day Nigeria use a similar method to determine guilt or innocent. However, the rivers that the accused traversed were populated by sharks. Water forms of trial by ordeal also juxtapose African and European swimming practices and beliefs about water. For Africans, culpability was determined by one's inability to swim. Conversely, white women's ability to swim was regarded oftentimes as proof that they were witches. Witch hunts occurred throughout Europe and America from the 1480s through the 1750s. And oftentimes, witches or women that were accused of witchcraft were subjected to swimming tests in which they were thrown into bodies of water, sometimes bound, sometimes not. If a woman could swim, it was concluded that the devil buoyed her up, or that the water, which had been blessed beforehand, rejected her impure spirit. Regardless, swimming proved her guilt, and she was subsequently executed. If she could swim, if she could not swim, she was deemed innocent, but usually drowned in the process. After learning to swim at an early age, many coastal and interior African men and women incorporated swimming into their recreational lives. Africans swam as forms of relaxation and incorporated swimming into different forms of competition. The swimming abilities of Africans in Senegal, the Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Cameroon were so strong that some independently invented surfing. Surfers and scholars of surfing believe that the first account of surfing was written in Hawaii in 1779. However, they are only 140 years too late and some 10,000 miles off. The earliest written record of surfing in Africa and the world was recorded in the 1640s. Surfing, again, was independently developed throughout Polynesia, in Peru, and in parts of Atlantic Africa. Today, one surfs while standing up. However, traditionally, surfing did not require one to stand. One could surf in prone, kneeling, sitting, or standing positions. For example, pre-Columbian fishermen in northern Peru surfed upon reed bundles that came to be known as caballitos, or little horses. These fishermen propelled their caballitos with wooden paddles while in a sitting position. And even in Hawaii, where surfing and surf culture became the most developed, sources indicate that many Hawaiians surfed in sitting, kneeling, and prone positions. Several factors restrict our understanding of African swimming or surfing. Unfortunately, only 4 known accounts were transcribed between 1640 and the early 1800s, while several others were recorded in the late 1800s and then into the early 20th century. There are no known accounts of early Africans standing up to surf. However, accounts clearly indicate that they rode waves for pleasure. The 2 earliest accounts are terse and rather ambiguous, even if one possesses a surfing background. Westerners witnessed Africans surfing, again, some 140 years before becoming aware of Hawaiian surfing, and did not become fascinated by Hawaiian surfing until the mid-19th century. The uninitiated eye of the first 2 European chroniclers caused them to dismissively treat African as well as Polynesian surfing as fanciful activities. Michael Hammersam, who was not the most careful observer and often provided rather shallow remarks, wrote the first known account of surfing in Africa sometime in the 1640s. Believing that he was watching Gold Coast children learn to swim, Hammersam wrote, "Parrots, quote, tie their children to boards and throw them into the water," end quote. John Barbeau wrote the next known account in 1679, noting that the children at Elmina, quote, learned to swim on bits of boards or small bundles of rushes fastened under their stomachs, which is a good diversion for spectators. African parents clearly did not teach their children to swim by tying them to boards and throwing them into the water. As previously documented, many Africans learned to swim at a much earlier age and with much more positive reinforcement. Additionally, such swimming lessons would have been highly dangerous, resulting in large numbers of drowned children rather than populations of proficient swimmers. These children were undoubtedly doing what many Cape Coast, Elmina, and children elsewhere are still doing today, which is lying on small boards and riding waves and actually making the cover of a surf magazine. Early accounts of Polynesian surfing are, importantly I should say, early accounts of Polynesian surfing are equally as vague as accounts of African surfing, and oftentimes got it entirely wrong. And also I should mention, most of the images that were drawn depicting surfing in Hawaii actually got it wrong. So into the late 1800s, drawings of surfing in Hawaii depict the sport incorrectly. Later accounts, however, of surfing in Africa are unambiguous. On November 16, 1834, while at Accra, Ghana, James Alexander wrote, quote, "From the beach, meanwhile, might be seen boys swimming into the sea with light boards under their stomachs. They wait for a surf and come rolling like a cloud on top of it," end quote. Thomas Hutchinson published the most comprehensive description of African surfing when he detailed fishermen surfing in present-day southern Cameroon. These fishermen caught waves in small, lightweight canoes that, quote, were no more than 6 feet in length, 14 to 16 inches in width, and from 4 to 6 inches in depth, and being made of light wood, are carried from the sea on the shoulder of their owners, end quote, making these canoes shorter than many of today's modern surfboards and many ancient Hawaiian surfboards. In a lengthy account, which I won't read, Hutchinson described how these Africans rode waves for pleasure, for the pleasure of surfing and to demonstrate skill and bravery. Though some were attacked by sharks, none drowned, causing Hutchinson to proclaim, quote, despite their immersion, no one is ever drowned, as they are capital swimmers. Indeed, like the majority of the coastal Africans, they may be reckoned amphibious, end quote. Even though Hutchinson did not seem aware of Hawaiian surfing, his description of Cameroonian surfing is remarkably similar to accounts that Mark Twain and Jack London and others would write several decades later about Hawaiian surfing. Africans and New World slaves fused swimming and blood sports when they fought crocodiles, hippopotami, and sharks. Men of African descent probably waged these contests to amuse themselves and publicly demonstrate their skill, bravery, strength, and possibly masculinity. Their bravery was undoubtedly enhanced by many white spectators' fear of water and the creatures that resided therein. Many Westerners regarded water as a dangerous, quote-unquote, unnatural element for humans to submerge themselves in, and were terrified of the creatures, many of the creatures, that black people battled. Thus, blacks' ability to swim with what whites perceived to be apparent ease while fighting creatures that petrified them were doubly impressive. African swimming dexterities and daring were exhibited when they dove beneath the water to fight sharks with knives. Jacques Lamar observed that when sharks turn themselves on their sides to seize prey on the surface of the water, quote, the Africans take this opportunity to strike him, and as he turns on his side, they dive under him and cut open his belly. Africans also waded and swam into waterways to battle more aggressive creatures. Africans fought Nile crocodiles, while their enslaved protege carried this tradition to the New World, fighting smaller, less aggressive American alligators and perhaps American crocodiles. Jean Labat narrated this conflict, the conflicts African waged with crocodiles, saying, notwithstanding the fierceness of this animal, the Negroes will venture to attack him in the shallow water. For this purpose, they wrap a piece of oxhide around their left arm and take a bayonet in their right hand. They wade or swim into the water in hopes of stabbing the crocodile in the eye or throat before they themselves can be devoured. Even more dangerous even more courageous swimmers entered the water to fight hippopotami. In 1862, Samuel Barker watched 2 hunters swim into a river to harpoon a bull hippopotamus that was basking on an islet. They swam underwater until they were within a few feet of the islet. Together, they, quote, together they rose from the water and, quote, hurled their harpoons. Then diving back under the water, they swam some distance and came to the surface. And after coming to the surface, they hastened ashore, lest an infuriated hippopotamus should follow them, end quote. Clearly, these marine battles were performed to impress white and black spectators who closely watched African swimming abilities and bravery from the safety of shore or a boat. Like other forms of spectator sport, these displays undoubtedly enhanced their reputations and community standings. Atlantic Africans have a rich swimming tradition. Many swam on a daily basis, permitting them to intimately interact with their environment. African swimming abilities allowed them to generate incomes, preserve their lives during maritime disasters, and demonstrate skill and bravery. African swimming prowess and Europeans' inability to swim also shaped relationships between members of these two groups. Even though Europeans regarded Africans as their inferiors, they were often compelled to respect Africans who, during maritime accidents, were often their only source of salvation. As enslaved Africans were carried off to the Americas, many took these skills with them, where they similarly incorporated swimming into their work and recreational activities. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions? Okay, we don't have the microphone, so please speak up loudly.
Okay, that was an excellent, excellent talk. I enjoyed it a lot. But there was something slightly jarring about one bit of your terminology.
That's actually a good point. I mean, it's, I guess I mean, part of it is preparing to talk is knowing your audience. And so, yeah, they're using the crawl. I should have used the term crawl. But when I've given similar talks to kind of more general audiences, they might not know the word crawl, whereas they recognize the freestyle. So that's why I use the freestyle style instead of the crawl. But you're absolutely right. I mean, in that the freestyle can denote, I mean, oftentimes people think of it as the crawl, but it can denote any style.
Anyone else? It's up in the museum, but it's going to be in one of the books that we're having. It's a bas relief drawing that's in Khartoum, you know, where they have the giant pillars and that part of Egypt. Not Khartoum, Karnak. Karnak. And there's a depiction of a guy stretched out with his feet back, with one hand out and the other hand up like this in an absolutely perfect crawl stroke position that dates to 1275 BC. Now these are Africans. And that picture of the Dongola men doing the perfect crawl stroke there, this was in 1884. Yeah. And the crawl stroke was not invented or discovered until about, Bob, 1901, was that the Cavills, 1899, somewhere in that area?
Well, there's also some in South Africa showing the crawl, some of these pictographs, and then I believe in, I'm not sure which one.
But not done by native artists.
Idea that by facing your head east back to Africa can channel your spirit back to Africa. And another really interesting one, I mean, kind of going off of this, related to this, is, I can't remember the name of this village, but there's a village in the Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire. And they maintain this belief of burying people beneath the water, not as a disrespect, but oftentimes as a sign of reverence. And Michael Jackson had gone there, I don't know, in the 90s, and after he died, and when he went there, they made him an honorary chief or something. And after he died, they wanted to bury him under the water in this river, which obviously didn't happen. But I mean, there are a lot of different beliefs about swimming. Most of them, though, relate to swimming in death.
Well, this is a little off, but kind of between the two of you guys, what do we know, or do we know anything about the Aboriginals of Australia